Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football week 10. And when the Saturday slate kicks off, we will officially be into the month of November. Teams continuing to bolster their resumes and look to secure one of the spots in the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts on the college football program, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, how goes it this Wednesday?
We're getting there. A little colder weather. That was, let's just say, an eye-opener the other day in Vegas.
I think you and I are getting a little bit soft, BP. Midwesterners at heart. If mercury dips below 60, the only man who's usually bundled up wearing a parka and a winter hat and his George Costanza puffy coat should be that man who should get a word in edgewise right about now.
50. Once it hits 50, I don't go outside. But in terms of this morning, feeling great, confident, upbeat. We've had a great morning together talking before the show. We're ready to roll, baby.
If only our listeners had a chance to peel back the curtain and listen to the 45-minute pre-show meeting, we'll call it, for a lack of a better term. I'm not sure what their feelings towards the three of us would be as a collective going, man, listen to these three curmudgeons over here bitching and moaning about everything under the sun. It's a pretty impressive feat. But yeah, an interesting...
This board sucks. There's. I was
going to use the word interesting, but sucks is definitely another adjective we can use to describe it. As we look to try and break down some of the marquee games on the board, and it's going to have a distinctly SEC and Big Ten flavor, which I don't think should shock anybody throughout the month of November, as those conferences are the most intriguing from top to bottom. So as we try and navigate through some of these troubled waters, we'll kick things off in lovely Fayetteville, where it's the Ole Miss Rebels, a 7-point road favorite in the game. Total on the contest, 53.5. These teams first met way back in 1908 and have met every season since 1981. Teams have alternated victories in each of the last 5 seasons, with the home team winning each game. Ole Miss with 4, Arkansas with 3 are the only FBS teams with 3+ games so far this season, with 600+ total yards. Credit to Bobby Petrino and an Arkansas offense. I don't think most of us saw this coming. Ole Miss, that was kind of the expectation, even if it's looked to operate in fits and spurts for extended stretches so far this year. And Brad, Ole Miss offensively, this is a group that's left a little bit to be desired week in, week out. We see them flash against some of the lightweights in the FBS early in the season. As they've stepped up in class against some of the teams in the SEC, the offenses lack that big play potential. Last week, they go into the half trailing Oklahoma 14-10. It was their defense that gave them the opportunity to win by a little bit of margin, albeit not enough, as a 20-point favorite. Played the game without Trey Harris, and while this is a group second in the FBS in total yards per game and yards per play, it sure doesn't look like that explosive, dynamic unit we anticipated early in the year, now matched up against an Arkansas defense that has some questions they need to address in their defensive backfield. But the one thing Arkansas has done extremely well is generate a little bit of pressure from that defensive line and do their best to eliminate some of the explosives that have plagued them in the past.
Yeah, I'm going to give a slight edge to Ole Miss offensively here, but I would have said, significant edge to Ole Miss offensively if we were doing this podcast a month ago. It would have been a slam dunk. Well, of course Ole Miss's offense is going to have their way here. No, I'm not so sure. And you mentioned some of the struggles once Ole Miss has hit conference play. I think it's more than that. I mean, I haven't seen a bigger significant discrepancy between non-conference and conference stats, I think, since I've been doing this the last 15 years. I mean, you look at Ole Miss offensively, number one offense in the country non-conference. They're averaging 55 points per game, 671 yards per game, running the football, completing passes. The last 4 games against SEC competition, from 55 points per game to 24 points per game. Knocked 270 yards of total offense per game off of what they were averaging. Can't run the football. Jackson Dart, but when it's got to, he's got to be overly relied on, isn't the most accurate passer. He's still, his full season stats look fine, but, that you would have liked to seen touchdowns instead of field goals a couple weeks ago against LSU, and you saw some similarly to some issues last week against Oklahoma. So what's the issue here? Well, to me, it starts up front. I mean, particularly since week 5, since the start of SEC play, this is an offensive line that was super experienced, but was kind of piecemealed together through the transfer portal. Well, as the competition's gotten a lot tougher, I mean, a pass blocking grade of 109th, a pressure percentage grade of 128th, run blocking grade of 125. That's since week 5. Just doesn't cut it for this offense. You mentioned the key injury last week. They certainly missed Trey Harris. This is a guy that led the nation in receiving at one point when he was healthy this year. Did not play last week. And, reading the tea leaves this week, I don't think it's a slam dunk that he's automatically back this week. They have some decent weapons, beside him and Caden Lee, Wells, and Watkins at wide receiver, but nobody's a superstar like Harris. They certainly worked the tight ends more without Harris last week. Priestcorn and Wright certainly got a lot more targets than what they're accustomed to. Parrish is a fine running back, but again, he's not a difference maker like a Quinshon Judkins like they had last year. So, what's the opportunity for Arkansas's defense here to have some success? Well, again, it starts, for Arkansas's sake, the strength of their defense is up front. I mean, their 2 best ball players are up front. Landon Jackson, obviously a known commodity from the last couple of years. He's graded out as their best player on defense. Their number 2 guy is Eric Gregory, a guy that's also gotten some pressure on that interior of the defensive line. Payne, and I had to go back and rewatch and read some stuff on him because him talking a couple weeks ago had me thinking, I was like, why don't I know more about this defensive coordinator? Williams had an awesome game plan against Tennessee, never really fully materialized against LSU, mainly because, they couldn't get consistent pressure against LSU, and that's the story of this game. If they get pressure, which, obviously Ole Miss has given up, then there's a pathway to success. If they don't get pressure, well, then the weakness of the Arkansas defense gets exposed, and that's obviously being their secondary, which, is 101st in success rate drop back, 121st in coverage grade. So that's the story of the game here. If Arkansas can take advantage of an Ole Miss offensive line that's struggling, then this is going to be a game that is definitely in doubt late in the fourth quarter. If they don't, then, even without a Trey Harris, even if he doesn't play, then Ole Miss is going to have some success down the field.
Payne, Brad mentioned the potential absence of Trey Harris, one of the injuries we're monitoring for Ole Miss on the offensive side, but defensively, they could be down a key contributor as well. Walter Nolan left the game late in the first half against Oklahoma. He's kind of the glue that holds that defensive line together, but in his absence, it still didn't slow down the Rebels and their ability to generate pressure. Now, then again, the 3 of us might be able to get some push against that Oklahoma offensive line as well, so it does come with a grain of salt. Arkansas offensively, though, a little bit banged up in the backfield. Jaquindon Jackson did not play versus Mississippi State. Didn't stop them from scoring nearly 60 points in that contest, but a player that we saw flash with 16 carries for 175 yards in Braylon Russell. Hamstring didn't appear to be 100%. Rashad Dubinion doesn't necessarily offer that same type of explosive big play potential. And Talon Green continues to be the X factor in terms of what he provides as a runner and a passer. But for all the questions that we have about Ole Miss and what we're going to get from this group offensively week to week, credit to Lane Kiffin and the rest of that staff. Pete Golding has the defense playing with a sense of purpose, and that has been the one constant for the Rebels in their quest to try and make a late push for the playoff.
So Talon Green has clearly improved since his time at Boise State, and Andrew Armstrong seems to have made a leap in year 2 at Arkansas. And you mentioned Jaquindon Jackson, highly questionable for this game, but seemingly got his life back on track. And then Petrino, I would say at this point, is a solid offensive mind. And those 4 guys have basically allowed Arkansas to exceed expectation this season and maybe give Sam Pittman a fighting chance to keep his job, although the schedule down the stretch is pretty difficult. I don't know the consistent path for Arkansas's offense here against Ole Miss. And if you really watch the Ole Miss defense, they've done a fantastic job slowing down RPO offenses specifically, right? They see a good version of that at practice every single day. And there is a massive mismatch on paper, and if it comes to fruition on the field, Ole Miss will not only win, but probably cover, and it's up front. Arkansas's offensive line, it's basically mirror deck chairs, right? There's lots of guys that have just been shuffling around. If you look at guys, left tackle, right tackle, the left guard, they're just moving pieces around trying to find the right five. And it's led to an Arkansas offensive line that's outside our top 100 in defensive line havoc and tackles for loss allowed. The Ole Miss front seven has been the dominant force all season, right? This was their all-in year. They paid for a bunch of dudes. It's the best defensive line they've had. They're top 10 in defensive line yards allowed, top 20 in havoc created and sacks. The key for Arkansas here is to avoid the negatives on offense so that there's a threat of run and pass. And you just look when the Hogs' offense is at its worst, even more so than most offenses, is when Taylon Green is forced to be a pocket passer on passing downs. So Arkansas has to stay ahead of the chains by preventing the negatives and allowing havoc. You mentioned the injuries to monitor, and they're huge because they're kind of the focal point of that mismatch, right? You have defensive tackle Walter Nolan. He left the Oklahoma game last week with a knee injury, did not return in the second half. For Arkansas, it's their two backs. Jaquindon Jackson missed last week with an ankle injury. Sounds like that's a long shot. His backup is the four-star freshman, Braylon Russell. He pulled a hamstring on an explosive run midway through the fourth quarter. So those are the three injuries to monitor. And they're important when you talk about staying ahead of the down and distance and being able to run. Those three guys have a massive say in that. I mentioned Ole Miss showing well against RPO offenses. Its linebackers have talked all week to media about being disciplined. And Ole Miss has faced an RPO offense with a mobile quarterback in Lenora Sellers. Certainly, I think Arkansas probably runs a better version of that when healthy. But Ole Miss has had to stay disciplined as a defense multiple times, not just with the RPO offense against South Carolina, but disciplined against Wake's wonky slow mesh. We saw them face an RPO system last week against Jackson Arnold in Oklahoma, and at times early on it gave Ole Miss some trouble, although the 2 touchdowns surrendered came on a 3rd and medium missed offensive pass interference in that 3rd and 9 before the half where Arnold was basically a magician. In the second half, Ole Miss just kind of snuffed out the Sooners offense and completely shut them down. But discipline has kind of been tested for the Rebels defense this season. It's a focal point again this week. Keeping Taylon Green in the pocket obviously is massive. His best work comes outside the pocket, outside of structure and on the move. Like we talked about Caleb Williams in backyard football last year. This is actually when Taylon Green is at his best, when it's that backyard football environment. The big-time throw rate is substantially better outside the pocket. His mobility is obviously a massive factor. Suntarine Perkins is the guy apparently being tasked with keeping eyes on Taylon Green this week. That'll be interesting to see. Chris Paul Jr. at linebacker has talked some this week. He was actually on the Arkansas defense a season ago, and Arkansas played Bobby Petrino's offense at Texas A&M, so there's been some talks internally from Ole Miss defenders about Chris Paul's familiarity with Petrino's offense and that being helpful this week to them. We'll see if that's narrative or fact, but kind of as I hear myself talk and then think about Brad's breakdown, I can see why this total came off the 55. I do think potentially waiting makes sense if you get the combination of Walter Nolan down, Trey Harris up. What that does potentially to market price. Trey Harris, I do believe, tries to give it a go. Is he going to be 100%? No, but having a vested interest in last week's Ole Miss game, I know Trey Harris was literally leading up to kickoff trying to get out there. They were working on his injury, an hour before kick, and he was like a true game time decision. So I would envision, another 6 days, he tries to give it a go. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about this
You
one.
mentioned Paul being the Arkansas transfer and someone's radar that he will be on. His own head coach, Lane Kiffin, who nearly eviscerated the kid for some of his boneheaded decisions with the late hits and over-aggressive play through the whistle. So we'll see if he's a little bit more buttoned up and disciplined.
He's been their best player on defense.
Oh, you got to play with
let the kid.
You got to
go.
play with your hair on fire, but taking 15-yard penalties in some of these games can be a little bit of a delicate proposition. This game did open at some prominent shops out here as low as 4, and we've seen Ole Miss move to the key number of 7 for this contest. Staying in the ACC, heading down to Jacksonville for the annual showdown between the Florida Gators and the Georgia Bulldogs on a neutral field. Georgia, 16-point favorite, more or less painted across the board. There are some 16.5s. Total anywhere from a low of 51.5 upwards of 52.5. As far as Georgia and Florida, this will mark the 102nd meeting. Gentlemen, you learn something new every day. Had no idea this rivalry was called the War for the Oar. So chalk that one up to something that I'd never heard it called during the course of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. First official meeting took place back in 1915. Teams have met every season since 1944 and every season since 1926, with the lone exception being in 1943. The game has been held in Jacksonville nearly every year since 1933. We know that's come under some discussion given the renovations that are going to take place at the Jaguars' home stadium coming up. Georgia, well, they've won 3 straight games versus Florida, each by 20-plus points for the first time since the mid-40s. And Billy Napier talking about the state of the Florida program, their mindset has kind of changed. This was a Gators team whose schedule on the surface looked extremely daunting, thought getting to 5 wins should be considered a success, maybe not enough to keep Napier's job. They sit at 4-4 with bowl eligibility maybe on the horizon if they can spring an upset or two. Georgia, they put together the most complete effort of the season. We'd seen from them heading into the bye with that outright upset of Texas as a 4.5, 5-point underdog. Brad, Georgia offensively, Carson Beck was all the rage coming in, one of the short shots on the board to win the Heisman. His performance has been erratic, and maybe that's not the best word choice to try and use there. Inconsistent, another one. Weaponry, Trevor Etienne has become the bell cow back as we anticipated. The transfer from Florida, pass catching options, maybe not the same for what Georgia has had in the past, but you get the chance for the bye to hit the reset button against the Florida defense that, look, is probably slightly below average, but is at least played with more of a sense of purpose in recent weeks. Should be a fascinating watch, but I have to imagine you're going to give Georgia the edge on this side of the ball.
Yeah, certainly edge Georgia. Could be a really significant one, but it all comes down to, how consistent Georgia is offensively, particularly Carson Beck. And I'll talk about the Florida defense that I think's, at least what we've seen the last 3 weeks, I think it's a little fool's gold due to, I don't think they've necessarily faced that great of offenses here the last 3 games. But starting with Georgia's offense with Carson Beck, you're right. I mean, a lot was expected. You certainly watched him them last couple quarters in the opener against Clemson. You thought, yeah, this guy is going to be, the number 1 pick in the draft coming up. But, I mean, he certainly had a lot of attempts. I think the surest bet, player props in college football is betting Carson Beck over passing attempts on an individual game basis. But with those attempts has become opportunities for him to make mistakes, and he certainly has done that. 8 interceptions already on the season. You look at his QBR's 20th. To me, a lot more was expected of him than that. Now, some of it is there's been some injuries on the offensive line, particularly Tate Ratledge, who's their best offensive lineman, has been out the last 4 games. He's getting a lot of reps in practice. Not sure if he gives it a full go this week, but let's certainly keep an eye on him if they get him down the stretch as the games get more and more important. He's got some nice weapons, Carson Beck, surrounding him. You mentioned Etienne, who has become a little bit of that go-to back, and I expect to certainly play with a chip on his shoulder against his former team this week. I mean, he thought he should have been getting the majority of the carries at Florida. The problem, there's a lot of problems. Arian Smith, Lovett, Dylan Bell, Lawson Lucky, Oscar Delp are all fine pass catchers, but this is Georgia. You're recruiting 5 stars. You're looking for, All-American types, and I hate to say it, obviously there's no Brock Bowers walking through that door. There's not a slot guy you can count on like a Ladd McConkey. There's no Todd Monken calling the plays. They've downgraded at all those spots. And that's why I think you've seen a little bit of inconsistency and why they haven't been as good as what they were a couple of years ago. But fortunately for them, to me, they're facing a Florida defense that, on the surface looks improved, and compared to last year, and maybe significantly improved. I'm not going to deny that, but you still dive into, you get beyond some of the basic counting stats. This is still a Florida defense, number 94 in defensive success rate, number 121 versus the rush in success rate, number 115 in coverage grade. If you take out the game where they locked down an FCS opponent in Sanford, they don't tackle normally overly that well, number 79th in the country in tackling grade. And then you look at what they faced here in this recent stretch. UCF, who can't throw the football, struggling mightily on offense. Tennessee having their own issues offensively, and then Kentucky, who's struggled on offense all season. I just go back to the teams that they have played that are a little bit more consistent and legitimate offensively. Certainly Miami, one of the best offenses in the country, threw all over them in the opener. A&M ran all over them. Hell, even Mississippi State, who's got I think a better offense than expected, ran all over them. I know Payne watched a lot of Florida games. I don't see a lot of dudes, on this defense. Sapp's a good guy up front. Pup Howard's fine at linebacker, but, to me, not a lot of Jimmys and Joes. I still think the X's and O's leave a little bit to be desired. So if Carson Beck is dialed in, and he put, maybe he's focused in and not, worrying about the Lamborghini or the Instagram girlfriend or adding another tattoo to his, sleeve on his arm. There should be opportunities here for Georgia to really expose this Florida defense.
Do we think, Brad, and Payne, we'll come to you in a second to get the full DJ Lagway experience when Florida has the football on offense. Brad, that Georgia potentially turned a corner with that season-defining win at Texas, or was that just more, hey, look, we've shown everyone our ceiling now, but we're going to return to being a team that's going to give you uneven performances during the month of November?
I think it was more on the defense side of the ball. I saw the pass rush when I hadn't seen Williams and Jalen Walker on the defensive front all season. So that to me was the turning point. There was still a lot of inconsistencies on that Georgia offense, particularly. They could have slammed the door even quicker than what they did. They settled for field goals. They had multiple interceptions. So I still didn't see it offensively. It was, Payne's going to talk about it. It was the defense that was shocking how that pass rush went from non-existent to like, oh my God, if they play like this is the best pass rush in the country.
And you mentioned Mikael Williams, a player that Kirby Smart has said earlier this week, still not at 100% on a full go, is out there on a limited snap count. Maybe that allowed him to be more disruptive along that Georgia offensive line. Georgia's outside linebacker, Chaz Chambliss, saying the Bulldogs didn't feel like it had played up to its standard prior to its showdown with Texas 2 weeks ago. So maybe the light bulb goes on, Payne, making it a daunting task for a relatively inexperienced quarterback in DJ Lagway, who we know has the measurables and the capabilities as an athlete, just probably not the polish given the limited reps so far this season. Attempted deep balls frequently against Kentucky, was able to connect, getting players like Elijah Badger, Shamir Dyke involved in the passing attack. Jaden Baugh ran the football successfully, but going up against Kentucky at home in Gainesville, a far cry from Georgia on a neutral field in Jacksonville for the rivalry game and what we'll see Saturday.
Yeah, I think kind of what you're suggesting is this is a lot to ask of DJ Lagway, and I would agree, right? The talent's off the charts, but there's still some holes in his game as a true freshman, which is to be expected, and Florida's offensive line has to play their best game of the season here. And they've held their own the last two games at Tennessee and against Kentucky, two very good front sevens against the Vols. Florida's offensive line showed well in pass protection, 26% pressure rate allowed. Against Kentucky, the line helped create more than 2.5 yards per rush before first contact for Jaden Baugh. The pressure rate allowed doesn't look great against Kentucky, but Lagway held the ball forever and was hunting deep shots. And so, how does Florida's O-line hold up here? Certainly it's trending better, but if you just look at the entire picture this season, it's still a Gators offensive line that's outside the top 90 and front seven havoc allowed. I would envision Kirby sees the success his defense had against the very good Texas O-line and replicates that style. I know we've pounded the table for multiple years, even when Kirby had elite defenses to crank up the aggression. We saw glimpses of that with 16 blitzes against Texas, lots of games and stunts. And Kirby's direct quote on the field after the game was that that we came to hunt. Our intent was to eat. So let's hope that's the case, but I do get the vibe that maybe it's not as aggressive because there's articles and conversations being had about limiting Florida's explosive plays. So you're hoping that aggression remains up front. Now, I think Napier usually has a good initial game plan and script. We've even seen it in some of these matchups against Georgia where early, hey, they're in the game, but then it starts to balloon late. I think we'll probably see more of Lagway's legs is what I'm hearing in this. And so, I'm all for the Steph Curry Golden State offensive approach here where it's a layup, a run play, or a 3-ball, a deep shot. Lagway does have a monster arm. His ADOT was nearly 22 yards against Kentucky. The deep accuracy was off the charts, but Kentucky was down their top cover corner. And if you look at the short and intermediate throws, Lagway was dreadful. So I can see Florida, if they can protect long enough, then there's probably going to be a few boom plays downfield to DK or Badger. Georgia is outside the top 40 in explosive pass rate allowed. We've seen Everett and Humphrey struggle to kind of be fluid and make plays on the ball when they're asked to defend deeper downfield. But Florida's O-line has to find a way to protect and create some room to make the run game a threat. Otherwise, Lagway becomes a sitting duck if he can only throw deep and continue struggling with the short and intermediate throw game.
A final thing on this game, any expectations as we sit kind of in no man's land if we think we'll see more Florida money, some Georgia money? I mean, talking to some of the shops around, this appears to be a relatively perfect number, at least as far as the betting public is concerned. Maybe buying Florida off the wind in their sails after some recent results and still a little bit skeptical about Georgia going out there and commanding this type of price tag given the inconsistent season thus far.
I don't know. I got a little bit of an overlay here. Maybe I was too optimistic with what I saw Georgia against Texas, and me still not on a down and basis buying Lagway. I still think, obviously, more talent, a stronger arm, can throw it down the field better than Mertz, but Mertz, I don't think, got enough credit for being a guy that took care of the football the last year and a half. So I am higher than this, and I have bet Georgia.
Should be an interesting game Saturday afternoon. Georgia continuing to try and rack up victories. Florida just fighting to get to that 6-win threshold. A little bit different stakes in terms of ACC prominence that we'll see unfold in Dallas-Fort Worth Saturday night when Pittsburgh travels to take on SMU. It's the hometown SMU Mustangs, a full touchdown favorite in this game. Number actually out to 7.5. Total has come down a touch from 60 at a peak into that 58.5 range. One of two ranked matchups this weekend on the schedule. I'm not sure anybody, including Pittsburgh fans, anticipated this team being unblemished this late in the calendar year. First regular season meeting between these programs since 1948. Matchup features two of the four remaining undefeated teams in the ACC, Miami and Clemson, a potential doomsday scenario sorts for the ACC, a legitimate chance that Miami, Clemson, and SMU or Pittsburgh could all finish undefeated in that particular regard. Pittsburgh 7-0 for the first time since 1982. When Dan Marino was their starting quarterback, they have not played an AP-ranked team yet this season. They can join Indiana this year as the only teams in the Division I era since 1973 to start 8-0 after having 3 or fewer wins the year prior. Excludes the 2020 pandemic season, of course. SMU, well, this will mark their first home game since September 28th. Some have called it arguably the program's most important home game over the last 40 years. A little bit of hyperbole, but I'll defer to the Dallas sports writers for that, given the level of importance and the inside track they could have to get to a conference championship game as they make the move from G5 to Power 4. First team to start 4-0 in conference play after making that move from some of the lesser leagues into playing with the big boys, but plenty of questions about quarterback availability on both sides. And Brad, we can start with Pittsburgh, where Eli Holstein had a 13-yard run on a quarterback keeper, went out of bounds after a tackle against Syracuse, went into the medical tent, left, and went to the locker room, not returning. Nate Yarnell took over. It was at a point in the game where Pittsburgh appeared to have the game comfortably in hand, and we know Coach Narduzzi loves to play the games about player availability, who may or may not be out there. Overall, from Pittsburgh offensively, what have you seen this year under first-year offensive coordinator Cade Bell that leads you to believe they'll have a chance to move the football consistently against an SMU defense that probably doesn't get enough credit for how stout they've been while the offense has tried to find its way?
Yeah, let me first start with a compliment of Narduzzi for the fact that he went outside his bubble and hired, a guy that runs an up-tempo offense, wide-open offense. So kudos for him, and obviously it's paid off. And then some with Pitt still unbeaten. Basic counting stats look pretty good. 13th in the country in yards per play, number 6 in the country in scoring. Deeper dive, particularly into the recent trend line, says this offense, there's some issues here, and I certainly don't like that trend line off back-to-back, their worst offensive performance of the seasons, as there's been more tape on this new offense, this new look, but teams have certainly adjusted. I mean, I'll start with the Cal game. I bet Pitt that week. They put 17 on the board early. I'm pretty comfortable because Cal's coming off the game against Miami that I thought they gave an all-out effort. And then in the final 40 minutes of the game, this Pitt offense scored 0, big fat 0 points in that one. And then you're thinking, they rebounded last week. If you didn't watch the game, they scored 41. I mean, this Pitt offense is fine. No, Pittsburgh scored 41. The Pitt offense didn't score 41. The Pitt defense outscored the Pitt offense in the game with 3 pick sixes. So only 217 yards in that game. I get it. Once you got out to the big lead, you didn't have to do much, and obviously got limited possessions because your defense keeps intercepting the opponent. But again, the past game, the last 2 games, 133 and 144 yards, doesn't leave me a lot of confidence here that they can attack this SMU defense deep. Holstein, you mentioned it. Again, the basic counting stats says he's been fine. 64%, 17 touchdowns, 5 picks, but I mean, dive just one step further, deeper, 79th in QBR, number 82 offensive grade, 14 turnover-worthy plays that he's made, 3rd most in the Power 5. So there's been a lot of turnover luck. The fact that 14 turnover-worthy plays and only 5 picks, certainly banged up last week. Narduzzi calls it dirt in his eye and said it ain't that big of a deal. He could have came back in, but now, flash forward a few days later, maybe it's a little bit more serious than we thought. I don't think Yarnell's a serious downgrade. This is a guy that's gotten experience last year and a little bit this year. The guy that's been their star is Desmond Reed, the Western Carolina transfer, came over with Bell, the OC. Leads the team in rushing, 2nd in receiving, big play threat. Although some of his production's gone down. I mean, he's not the biggest stature guy, and as
great point on his durability.
Yeah. As you play stronger, tougher opponents, he's coming from FCS. He's touched the ball a lot. His usage rates, I just wonder how he's going to be that down the stretch of this season. A lot of concerns, even if Holstein was healthy here, especially you mentioned it. To me, an SMU defense doesn't give enough, publicity. I mean, you look at a team that ranks number 2 in the country in run defensive grade, allowing less than 100 yards per game. So I question Pitt's ability to run consistently. SMU gets after the quarterback. They have the 2nd highest pressure rate in the country. TCU and Louisville, if you look at them on a game-by-game basis, were able to throw, but still, I mean, the back end's pretty, cleaned up. 53% completion rate this year. I mean, if you believe in PFF's grades, I mean, they got 2 of the top 20 defensive players on overall defensive grade in the entire country. Roberts up front in defensive end, safety Naquobia. They brought in a lot of high-level power transfers. And, maybe the guys weren't happy with a lot of their playing time, but the last couple of years that they have played at a very high level at SMU. So whoever was in charge of their portal has done a really good job. I'm going to give the edge here to SMU's defense, whether Holstein plays, doesn't play, is fully healthy or not healthy. I like SMU.
Payne, coming into the year, when we were discussing SMU on our preview podcast, we thought this team offensively was going to be in a great spot. 2 quarterbacks that had very different skill sets. Preston Stone, a little bit more of a pocket passer, started the year, but SMU was unable to keep him upright, so Rhett Lashley and company decide to make the switch. They go to Kevin Jennings, whose mobility move the pocket some, could take off when protection around him broke down, and allow SMU to do some things that, Preston Stone probably couldn't provide. SMU so far this season, in terms of what they've been able to do at home, this is a group averaging 49.8 points per game in their last 11 home games, but there are injury concerns coming into this spot. Lashley has been mums in terms of who the starting quarterback could be. Said if the Jennings can't go, we don't have a problem. It's going to be Preston Stone. Brashad Smith has come on as their true RB1, but there was a massive loss for SMU in their receiving room. RJ Maryland, the son of Russell Maryland, who will most likely hone his craft on Sundays, was injured in that 40-10 win against Stanford. As you go through the laundry list of other receivers that SMU has, nobody had the same pass-catching volume as Maryland, and you wondered if there was going to be an adjustment period. And for all the concerns we have about Pittsburgh's offense that Brad highlighted, quietly this Pittsburgh Panthers defense has been the group that's turning the corner, and no greater manifestation of all of that than showing they had 6 non-offensive touchdowns this season, 3 coming last Thursday night against Syracuse, even if the stop unit was out on the field for more than 90 defensive snaps and 40-plus minutes in time of possession.
Yeah, I think I'm in lockstep with both of you guys in that my very first thought on this side of the matchup is as simple as can be, right? Regression. SMU's offense turned it over 6 times last week at Duke, overcame it, and I didn't really think about downgrading them even though they didn't come close to meeting expectation. And then Pittsburgh's defense created 5 turnovers. 3 of them were pick sixes. You mentioned Pittsburgh's defense trending up the last month. That is accurate. Players have talked about increased comfort in the system, and with that, we've seen defensive coordinator Randy Bates hike up a lot of the exotic coverage and blitz packages. Now, the schedule of offenses Pittsburgh's faced this season hasn't been great. Not a single top 30 offense in schedule-adjusted efficiency. Syracuse did, however, have a top 20 passing attack with a veteran quarterback, and that Pittsburgh defense confused Kyle McCord pretty much the entire game. But if Kevin Jennings is healthy, and there is, to your point, some question with that, this will be far and away the best offense Pittsburgh has faced, so they're stepping up in class here. I do think something has to give up front in this matchup. SMU runs the ball a few percentage points over expectation, so they like to stay ahead of the down and distance and then try to hit explosives in the pass game when defenses ultimately stack the box. And potentially without RJ Maryland, Pittsburgh stacking the box and blitzing maybe doesn't allow SMU to expose some of the one-on-one advantages they'll have deep down the field. SMU's run offense on the season, top 25 in EPA per rush. Pittsburgh's defense, top 5 in EPA per rusher allowed. So it's really a good-on-good matchup there, and that, to me, ultimately decides this side of the matchup. If you're watching this game and SMU is living in 2nd and 6 and 3rd and 3 and 3rd and 2, right, advantage Mustangs. But if you force Kevin Jennings to throw the ball on predictable down and distances, it really shrinks his ability as a quarterback, just to be completely candid. And that's reflective in SMU's offense being outside the top 80 in passing down success rate. And it probably isn't going to get better against a defense that's trending up. And as you mentioned, again, potentially without RJ Maryland. So Rhett Lashley, I think, to me, how I would approach this is use Pittsburgh's aggressiveness against them and help Jennings with a lot of pre-snap motion and misdirection. And I would actually maybe have him throw on early downs as a little bit of a change-up. If it's not Jennings or Jennings can't finish the game, Preston Stone is a more than capable backup. I know people were... I think that the move to Jennings was clearly justified, and we saw a spark with SMU's team with Jennings, but at this point, having a backup like Preston Stone is a really nice commodity that other teams don't necessarily have. And I know he can't provide the same ability in the run game as Jennings, but remove the 3 pick sixes from your brain and use the entire 7-game sample size for Pittsburgh's defense. The weakness of that unit is their back end. They're outside the top 70 in passing success rate allowed. And again, prior to the defensive circus that will distort some of the EPA metrics with 3 scores, Pitt came into that Syracuse game outside our top 95 in EPA per pass allowed. So you almost wonder if it's smart for Rhett Lashley to break tendency and throw on early downs to then set up the run game.
You want to talk about two teams coming in from opposite ends of the spectrum. SMU -6, credit to their defense, did not give up a single point, despite their offense putting them in a precarious predicament more often than not. On the road at Duke last weekend, outlasting the Blue Devils to win that game by 1 point in overtime, and Pittsburgh's defense taking the burden of proof off an offense that's struggling to find an identity. Final word to you, Brad, on this game in terms of number. I have to imagine books are going to find themselves dealing with a ton of Pittsburgh +7, +7.5 tickets now, I should say, as the number has moved through the key. Folks looking to bet the Panthers on the money line as well. I won't say it takes on a similar tenor to Navy Notre Dame last week, where we saw a full class difference emerge despite the general public thinking it was too good to be true with Navy as a heavy underdog. But what kind of adjustments have you made to these two teams since the start of the year, given that SMU's offense hasn't been as dynamic and Pittsburgh clearly a team that when you go through their win total, none of us anticipated being undefeated playing into November?
I was down on Pitt. I mean, I bet under their win total, so I have, upgraded them about 5.5 points since the start of the season, because, I mean, they've already passed that win total that I thought was I got a good number on that. I thought was a sure thing. Obviously, there are no sure things, especially in today's day and age of college football. So, pretty significant upgrade there. SMU was already high and then bet over, got in front of all that hype train there, upgraded them a couple of points. Yeah, I'm right. Right now, the power rating is right where the number is. I made it 7.6. Obviously, as far as moving forward is all going to be dependent on if you time the quarterback news, whether, is Jennings in or out, Holstein in or out. You time that right. I think there's opportunity here to ride some ponies.
Pretty wild to see. SMU was a win total that took a decent amount of money over the total. A lot of folks panicking early in the season when SMU lost on a Friday night as a double-digit favorite to BYU. That loss to the BYU Cougars hasn't aged like milk. It's actually aged like fine wine, and every win that BYU picks up actually bolsters SMU's resume, especially if they're able to get a big win against Pittsburgh on Saturday night at home. First time they're playing in Dallas since late September. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media, but most importantly, for all things podcast related, be sure to follow the Bet the Board podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Gentlemen, it's been all SEC, a little dash of SEC so far. It's time for us to delve into Big Ten country here, with Oregon going on the road to Ann Arbor to take on the reigning national champion, the Michigan Wolverines. Third meeting ever between the AP number one team and an unranked reigning national champion. We saw it happen back in 1961. We saw it happen in 2020 between Alabama and LSU. Sixth meeting in series history. Michigan leads 3-2. Oregon won the last meeting in Ann Arbor, which was an eternity ago, back in 2007, 39-7, a year that Michigan fans probably don't want to revisit because the week before they lost to Appalachian State. Oregon last week against Illinois looked great in the first half, built a 35-3 lead before they took their foot off the accelerator. It was actually the largest halftime lead by any FBS team so far this season versus a ranked opponent, with Oregon up 32. They come in, the Ducks do, with the second longest active win streak in the country at 9, behind just Army, who sits riding an 11-game winning streak. Meanwhile, for Michigan, they're one of 4 reigning national champions to lose 3 of their first 8 games in the BCS college football playoff era. 2007 Florida, 2011 Auburn, and 2020 LSU. It'll be the first game versus an AP number 1 ranked team since 2006 for the Wolverines, when they took on Ohio State, lost that game 42-39. The number's not great for Michigan's illustrious history when taking on the top team in the land. Offensively, Brad, Michigan at least knows who their starting quarterback is going to be. I have to imagine that Davis Warren will be their guy for the foreseeable future after Jack Tuttle forced into a medical retirement, and them using Alex Orji last week as kind of a change of pace guy to run the football. Michigan, I mean, they've gone 14 straight games now with under 225 passing yards. It's the third longest active FBS streak behind just Air Force and Army. The ground game remains a 1-2 punch. The offensive line a little bit healthier than what it's been against an Oregon defense that's allowed a grand total of 9 points in their past 2 games, the fewest in a 2-game span since 2019. And Dan Lanning's fingerprints all over this group, even if they're not fully healthy with their stop unit, and something you highlighted a few weeks ago has been a little bit vulnerable when teams want to run the football against them.
Yeah, no surprise here. Edge to Oregon's defense, but maybe even a significant one. You mentioned on the bright spot for Michigan's offense, Davis Warren. I mean, you can make a case that easily had the most efficient game out of a Michigan quarterback this season last week. Final numbers, when you throw in Donovan Edwards' halfback pass, 14 out of 20, near 150 yards. That's kind of what you need if you're going to have some success out of this Michigan offense. Although, it worked against Michigan State. Obviously, you got a talent upgrade, at least as far as your opponent did this week. I'll mention a couple positives. Obviously, Mullings at running back, number 7 in the country in weighted EPA per rush, has been the guy all year. Edwards, obviously, we found out can never be the bell cow. He's not built to. He always needs a running mate there at the running back position. Loveland at tight end. By far leads the way. He's pretty much their only receiving option with over 400 yards because you look at their next 4 receivers behind him, they've combined for less than what Loveland has as far as receiving. So it's pretty much a 2-guy offense in Mullings and Loveland. If you contain those guys, then, you're containing this Michigan offense to say the least. There's not a lot of things they do well, particularly in the pass game. A number 121 passing offensive grade, number 114 in early down. So a lot of times, if they're not successful in early downs, you put them in 3rd and long, and you got a team that's number 87th in the country in EPA per dropback. So you look at their run game, you thought, at least they can lean on the run game. Well, that was still the case early in the season against Arkansas State and a Lincoln Riley defense in USC. But the reality is teams have stacked the line of scrimmage. They've only topped 175 yards in those 2 early September games. Since then, it hasn't been. You haven't found a similar running the pass and running lane. So I don't see a pathway for Michigan's offense here to have much success unless they're in short field situations, able to broken down, the missed tackles by Oregon's defense, which I just don't see because Oregon defensively is getting better. They're not. I would say they don't look like a top 10 defense, at least to me. But then again, I'm grading them on like a national championship type scale, and I'm not sure that anybody is. If we're comparing them to what Georgia was a couple years ago, or Alabama in 2020, or the LSU offense in 2019, nobody in college football offensively or defensively is really matching that type of thing. But what we have seen is a defense that's number 6 in EPA per dropback. Not that they're going to have to worry about that this week. Number 2 in coverage grade. Again, not that they're going to have to worry about that this week. They're actually playing. I mentioned Ole Miss playing way worse as the competition's gotten tougher. Oregon's defense is the opposite. They're playing better since the early games against Idaho and Boise State. They're allowing 8 points per game less in Big Ten play. Ohio State's the only team that's really been able to move consistently on them. Obviously downgraded as far as the talent level that they're facing this week on Michigan's offense. So, it's pretty simple here. You're going to lock down the Michigan wide receivers that don't scare you outside of Loveland at tight end. You're going to put 8 guys in the box. You got Derek Harmon, to me, is the most impressive guy on the interior. You saw him flash against Ohio State, change that game. You got pass rushers. Uyunglele's got 5.5 sacks. Hearing more positive reports that Jordan Birch in limited action so far this season, who has 5 sacks, he might be able to return after missing the last few games. So, had it all up, I'd be stunned if a Michigan offense hit 20 here.
And I buried the lead at the top. Oregon more than a 2-touchdown favorite in this particular spot, making Michigan a home underdog of 14-plus points for the first time since 2013 when they took on the Buckeyes and were catching 16.5 in that spot. Total on the game, 45.5. And Payne, if the total is going to have a chance to go over, it's going to be dictated by Oregon offensively. And this is an offense led by Dylan Gabriel that leads the FBS in points per game and yards per game, or at least has under Dan Lanning since he took over back in 2022. We've seen Oregon, when they want to score and want to move the football, look explosive and dynamic. Brad talked about how their defense has trended up in conference. The offense feels like it does just enough before they take their foot off the accelerator, but it shouldn't take away from what Gabriel has been able to do, providing a calming veteran presence under center, much like Bo Nix did last year, becoming the third quarterback since 2000 to start 8-0 with a 75% completion percentage with 30-plus attempts per game, alongside college football greats Colt McCoy and Joe Burrow. His 76% completion percentage leads the FBS this season. And defensively for Michigan, this is a group that can generate pressure. We know about a couple of their players that'll be playing on Sundays. Oregon's offensive line was a major concern coming into the season. Early on, it looked like all of those fears were realized, but they've solidified that group. And if Michigan can't generate pressure with their defensive front, this is a back end that leaves a lot to be desired, especially if Will Johnson continues to miss time as their elite cover corner.
Yeah, bingo. You hit it. Let's move on. I'll be quicker because we talked last week about Oregon's offense finding itself and having synergy in what it wants to do and who it wants to be, and the Ducks O-line is improving, and Jordan James down to down is finding that efficiency, even if the game breakers for him aren't materializing. And then you have Tez Johnson just spamming the slant RPO game. And I think we talked about if backers and safeties cheat, Evan Stewart is able to take the top off one-on-one. And then there's been chatter among the Ducks receiver group about Justice Lowe's emergence being a foregone conclusion. Now, he flashed all spring, back-to-back his two best games. Brad mentioned the return of Jordan Birch to practice. Well, tight end Terrence Ferguson returned to practice for the Ducks Monday as well. And, at the same time Oregon's offense is trending up, we've kind of been critical of Michigan's defense. And honestly, we've been critical from Michigan's defensive perspectives from the moment they hired Wink Martindale. And, with many of the same pieces as last year, Michigan's defense has gone from elite, number one, to outside the top 20 in multiple key metrics, and in some areas, substantially worse. But you have to get to Oregon's offensive line to have a chance at slowing them down, cause chaos. This shocked me. Michigan's D-line, with multiple NFL draft picks, is outside our top 80 in havoc created. How in the world can that be possible with a D-line that has Graham and Stewart and Moore? And I know Benny's missed some time, but, and then you hinted at the secondary having real issues outside our top 70 in EPA per pass allowed when adjusting for schedule. And we've highlighted multiple times this season the issue Michigan is having defending throws to the side of the field not occupied by Will Johnson, and Will Johnson's status is in question. Didn't play in the rivalry game against Sparty. Sharon Moore doubled down this week and said Will is 100% hurt, that he's not protecting his draft status.
I'd protect my draft status if I was Will Johnson and already had a national championship ring on my resume.
So, Will Johnson is competing to be the number one corner taken in April's draft. Sometimes those nagging injuries can be played through. Other times there might not be a willingness to do so. We'll see. Something to monitor. I wanted to lay it with Oregon here, but it's been bet out past 14, and so I've kind of let the game go. My numbers would actually show value on Michigan, but I am not backing them. The path for Michigan, I guess, is, if you want to play devil's advocate, is Michigan's front plays the best game of its season, and the talent is there to have a surprise effort, and Will Johnson miraculously returns, and the Wolverines shorten the game and find success on the ground because the Ducks have been susceptible to the rush attack. But I think Brad hit it perfectly. You're just going to stuff guys in the box, and eventually numbers win. And Davis Warren isn't able to take advantage of the numbers game outside and down in the field. But that's the path to keeping this game close. It's just three monster ifs that all need to happen simultaneously. And to me, this feels like a game you maybe bet live because of game state being really crucial here. If Oregon gets out, it could snowball if Davis Warren and Michigan's pass game has to chase here. So that's kind of my viewpoint on this one.
Yeah, I think the live angle is fascinating and would definitely be something I'd have on my radar. Just wish I had more confidence in Oregon's willingness to go out there and expand leads in the second half. Once we saw
that was our concern last week, right? It was like, hey, this could be a 24-point game to start the fourth quarter, and sure enough, like Illinois is a 2-point conversion away from having it be a 24-point game in the fourth quarter, and they were driving.
Yep,
and couldn't punch that score across, but that's your fear sometimes with Oregon, that Dan Lanning understands the objective at this point. It is to stay healthy, play young guys, survive and advance, and the next big game on the schedule is potentially a rematch with Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. And even if you were to falter there and lose, you're still in the college football playoff. So there really isn't this need to go out and blow everyone out. There's no style points needed. Now maybe he looks up and he sees, hey, oh my God, Dylan Gabriel leading in the Heisman.
That would be nice. That would be nice.
Yes.
We're out here, in recruiting battles. Having a Heisman quarterback certainly helps gain some more interest from offensive recruits. So maybe that's potentially a saving grace, but I don't know. I just don't see it.
Go out there and win this game by 5 touchdowns. Make sure you send a nice text to Bryce Underwood and tell him that Phil Knight will match the $5 million collateral that Michigan is rumored to be throwing at the number 1 quarterback recruit to try and lure him away from LSU.
Isn't he? Yeah, I was going to say he's already committed to LSU. That'll be interesting to see.
I mean, look, I've watched.
If you're that kid,
I've watched the Michigan offense. If I'm the top recruit in the country, there's no chance I'm going to play college football at Michigan.
It's got to be life-changing money.
Yeah.
Right, and that's kind of, this is on a far different spectrum, but we are seeing now at the baseball level where these young kids who have not been paid don't want to continually go through the 4 or 5 years of arbitration, and these franchises are locking them into the 11-year, $100 million deal, as opposed to like in year 5 waiting for the $400 million deal. This kind of has that element where, like Bryce Underwood's saying, hey, I can get $5 million now. Is that better than taking $2 million from LSU and potentially getting developed and earning more down the line? Like it's kind of been for a lot of these kids, not all of them, the quick buck mentality. But it would be very difficult. And if you were Michigan, you would have to substantially outbid LSU, because if you're Bryce Underwood, regardless of what we think of Brad's boy there. LSU has produced good quarterbacks the last 2 years, one being a Heisman and who has also taken the NFL by storm in year 1 as a rookie.
Well, I mean, let me tell you, if Bryce Underwood, if you plan to buy Ferraris and Lamborghinis for Instagram model girlfriends, then yeah, you need the $5 million in college. If not, and you want to hone your craft for the NFL, go to the spot that'll best allow you to try and achieve all of your hopes and dreams at the next level. Normally, guys, this is the portion of the program where we kind of look to pivot. We want to highlight the little guy and make sure that we give people a G5 rooting interest for the week. But we're going to audible a touch, and because we love the SEC oh so much, we're going to stay in the SEC with a little Texas A&M and South Carolina discussion, with A&M going on the road a week after erasing a double-digit deficit at home against LSU. A&M a 2.5-point road favorite, total in the low 40s for a trip to Columbia to take on a rested Gamecock side. For your not-so non-Powers 5 pick this week, BP, A&M, short road favorite, South Carolina, home underdog, well-rested. How we get into the window in this contest, my friend?
Yeah, we're taking the home underdog, South Carolina. Not the greatest price now that the market's moved, although I might know a few people that are responsible for that move on South Carolina. I still think it's holding value, first and foremost. Let's start with the power rating. Made it A&M 1, and that's not even factoring the spot that I think is really advantageous for South Carolina. Statistically, A&M is slightly better if you just look at the basic counting stats, yards per play, yards per game, points per game margins than South Carolina, but South Carolina's played the tougher schedule, and A&M's, I think the scoreboards have looked better than the box scores, particularly recently. Last 4 games, A&M's been outgained in 3 of those 4 games, including last week. +2 in turnovers, 3 missed LSU field goals. Obviously caught LSU somehow by surprise with Marcel Reed, even though he's played more snaps than Connor Wegman this year. They didn't have a defensive game plan to adjust. I do find it interesting, though, that if Marcel Reed was so great, not trying to knock the kid, but if he was great, there was a law of diminishing returns in every start that he had when Wegman was originally hurt. Why would you go back to Wegman to begin with if Reed was that great? So I worry here that you got another game, a film on Reed. Not necessarily sure that he's going to take South Carolina's defense by surprise. And speaking of South Carolina's defense, the South Carolina defensive front, maybe Ole Miss is better. Maybe if Georgia plays the way they did against Texas is better. But I'm comfortable saying what they have up front, especially on the edges, is as good as anybody in the country. And, similar to the Notre Dame Navy handicap, just change one play in South Carolina season. What's the line? And it could be 2 different games. Change a play in the LSU game, a game they easily could have won and probably should have won.
That would have been nice.
Lead against
that would have been
LSU.
Nice for all of us.
They win that game. What's this line? Alabama game. I mean, South Carolina didn't even play that well in that game. They missed field goals. They had 4 turnovers, and yet they have the opportunity to go on the road, and they're right there at the end in the final seconds against Alabama. Change a play in that game, and that's a win. What's the line? It's probably pick. So, I mean, you change 2 plays, I mean, maybe they're favored here. So, I'm finding value in South Carolina because of the situation. Also, it's an underrated home atmosphere. You're catching A&M off of the big win. I like that old school. I will say it's not all sunshine and rainbows. I am concerned about a couple things.
O-line.
Yeah, A&M's defensive front against South Carolina's offensive line scares the bejesus out of me. And what also scares me is Lenora Sellers is a turnover machine. So it's not, I'm not saying it's the greatest bet ever. It's kind of a spot play. It's kind of a looking at the one team in my opinion is a little underrated just because of a play or two. A&M off the big win, a little overrated. You look in their box scores. I like South Carolina to win this game, provided Lenora Sellers takes care of the football for most of the game.
Protect the football, Lenora Sellers. Texas A&M, you look at their upcoming schedule, 5-0 in the SEC so far. Road trip to Columbia to take on South Carolina. They'll be at Auburn, and then they, of course, get their regular season home finale Thanksgiving weekend against Texas, which should be a marquee matchup and could determine who goes to the SEC title game if things were to break the right way. So you couldn't fault them if there's a little bit of a letdown this week. Payne, anything you wanted to add to this one before we get to arguably the marquee game of the entire college football weekend as we head back to the Big Ten country?
I think the hope is we've seen Lenora Sellers go from goggles to contacts. Maybe during the bye he went from contacts to LASIK, and all will be solved here. Jokes aside, though, it's 2.5 now. I think, as Brad alluded to, it's a fine price point. I don't think you get hurt by waiting. If you don't want to wait, I know there are some sophisticated listeners that probably have access, and we don't condone buying. But at 3 minus 20, this would be very appealing because you're looking at a game with a total of 44. This isn't a college football game with a total at 69 or 71. You wouldn't be making the case for that. But a total at 44, if you can get 3 minus 20, would be the better mechanical bet. And so we're starting to see some juice kind of trickle in here towards A&M, and that maybe be the way I would approach it is maybe at this point wait a touch. Or shop around, because as I am shopping around personally myself, there are some 3 minus 20 out there, which, again, typically don't condone buying, but with a total at 44, mechanically it makes some sense.
All about market entry and getting the best of the number, especially as you guys continue to build out your cards each and every week. No reason to go to market with some of the shorter prices that are out there, so take advantage of the asymmetric risk, especially in a game like this with a low total and a number hovering right around the key. Speaking of low totals and numbers hovering around the key, Penn State, Happy Valley, will be home to the marquee game of the college football weekend. Ohio State, a 3.5-point road favorite at Beaver Stadium, total down from where it opened. We're looking at 45, kind of as the prevailing price tag. They're meeting as AP top 5 opponents for the first time since 1996. It'll be the first AP Top 5 matchup at Beaver Stadium since 1999, when number 3 Penn State took on number 4 Arizona. This will be the 4th AP Top 5 matchup across all of the FBS this season, the most in any regular season since 2011. Speaks to what we discussed before the show, gentlemen, about the level of parity and all of these teams being flawed and matching inconsistency with one another. James Franklin, 1-12 versus AP Top 5 teams as Penn State's head coach, lost 10 straight in that department. Since 2021, Penn State 0-6 versus Ohio State and Michigan, 35-5 versus all other programs. But Ryan Day hasn't exactly been Ohio State's savior in this department. 2-6 versus AP Top 5 teams as Ohio State's head coach, 60-3 in all other games. Each team has been great defensively, especially in the third quarter, making those proper adjustments. We'll see if that continues to play out in this particular spot as well. And Brad, offensively for Ohio State, it wasn't pretty by any stretch of the imagination last weekend. Nearly a 4-touchdown favorite at home against Nebraska. What did the Scarlet and Gray do? They put up a season low in points, 21, season low in rushing yards, 64, season low in passing yards, 221, and total yards at 285, and go a robust 1 for 10 on third down. And Ryan Day said his biggest takeaway was he didn't like how his team sustained drives. Well, no shit, going 1 for 10, not going to win you a lot of big games. Now they match up against a better defense in Penn State, albeit a Nittany Lions stop unit that has some questions when they've gone up in class against teams that can throw the football. Bowling Green early in the year, USC more recently, but Penn State's defensive line should have an opportunity to go up against an Ohio State offensive line that leaves something to be desired. Buckeyes offense, Penn State defense. Who's got the edge?
I don't see a significant one because right now I think both units are overrated, but I'm going to give the slight edge to Ohio State here because, again, I think, good offense beats good defense. And notice I use good, not great here, even though coming in the season I think you would have thought, hey, great offense for Ohio State, great defense for Penn State. Not sure that's the case in current form. Will Howard, you look at the weighted EPA per dropback, number 1 in the country. Yay. Will Howard overachieving. I got to say that, the eye test says he's not been that great, especially when he's been under pressure, which I expect is going to be the case this weekend with that banged up offensive line. He's 6th worst passing grade among Power 4 quarterbacks under pressure this year. Judkins and Henderson, top 15 in weighted EPA per rush, and even though they've already topped over 1,000 yards combined on the season, last couple weeks hasn't been a great look. Judkins, 23 and 29 rushing yards for a guy that there was whispers of locker room issues at Ole Miss. You wonder if that continues when he's getting that kind of production, if that becomes an issue there in the locker room. Offensive line injuries are the big story. Josh Simmons out for the year, gets hurt against Oregon. Mikulski comes in for him the last 6+ quarters. He gets hurt last week. Ryan Day says he's a chance he'll play this week. What they did last week was they kicked their left guard, Donovan Jackson, moved out to left tackle. They put Luke Montgomery in at left guard. Mikulski was already struggling big time, especially last week. In the last 6+ quarters, a 15.6 pass blocking grade. What's that mean? Well, that's the 7th worst. That's the 7th worst among all, not power conference, all offensive tackles in all of college football in that time. So he was playing at a very, very poor level prior to getting hurt. You mentioned, by horrific rushing output last week, couldn't sustain drives. You mentioned the 1 out of 10 on third down. Yeah, it all comes down to that Howard's going to get pressure. Can he get a little bit of time? Because if he does get a little bit of time, obviously, last I checked, you still have Emeka Egbuka. You have Jeremiah Smith. Hell, Carnell Tate last week had his best performance this season. He had over 100 yards. So, and Ryan Day mentioned that he's going to, I get the feeling that they're going to take some shots here. And why wouldn't you? Because I think this Penn State defense, we've seen the better passing offense take advantage of them. It's funny that you mentioned Bowling Green there. Oh, they're one of the better off. Well, yeah, Harold Fannin Jr. is one of the best pass catchers in all of the country this year. And you saw USC's defense put up 400+ yards and 30 points. And I didn't think Lincoln Riley had that great of a game plan. Could have had more in that one. And USC hit some explosive in the run game. We'll see if that can happen here with Ohio State's. It has a couple of backs that are explosive. There's pieces, obviously, for Penn State's defense. Durant out front's graded out very well. Abdul Carter's starting to adjust to his new position. He's got 4 sacks. You got a pretty good lockdown corner in A.J. Harris. Jalen Reed at safety's been pretty productive for them. Key injury for them, though, especially when you're looking to really take advantage of a banged-up offensive line for Ohio State. Dennis Sutton, going to be a game-time decision. He's their other edge rusher outside of Abdul Carter that can really get after the quarterback, so that's a concern there. I just think if Ohio State doesn't necessarily, offensive line has to win the battle, but if they, hold their own, don't get beat too badly, I'm giving the slight edge to the Buckeyes offensive line because I'm not buying this Penn State team. I've seen it a couple times against better the offenses that they've faced, and it wasn't a great look.
Well, if you're not buying Penn State defensively, Brad, I'm not sure what Payne has to say about Penn State on the offensive side, as questions continue to swirl and circulate about who James Franklin and Andy Kotelnicki will have under center for the big game Saturday at noon Eastern. We saw Drew Aller unable to finish the game over the weekend against Wisconsin. Blake Pribula steps in and does a fine job in terms of adding a level of mobility. 11 of 13, 98 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, and completed his last 10 passing attempts. And clearly they'll have a game plan drawn up to his strengths and weaknesses more so than Aller, if Aller can't go with what we speculate is a sprained knee in some capacity. The one thing we have seen Payne from Penn State offensively, they have 26 passes of 20-plus yards this season. They had a grand total of 30 all of last season, and James Franklin didn't shy away. Said they needed to figure out how they could be more explosive this offseason, and of course that's why they lured the offensive coordinator from Kansas, and we're seeing Kansas's offense flounder without him. Ohio State defensively, though, I mean, this is a group that was a star-studded unit, a ton of 4 and 5 year guys that were out there that should have perfect grasp on Jim Knowles' system. They love to play multiple defensive backs. Lathan Ransom missed the game last week against Nebraska, was already a full participant in practice on Tuesday, which only helps. Ohio State defensively against Penn State's offense that really lacks a lot of big play potential, other than Tyler Warren, who's rapidly emerging as the next great tight end to come out of Happy Valley.
Two coaches we like, in Andy Kotelnicki and Jim Knowles. It's a fun matchup. Very clearly, Ohio State's going to have to prepare for both Alar and Pribula. It sounds like Alar will try and give it a go, but I would fully expect to see both, and it would make sense to prepare for both, which is tough because I think Alar and Pribula are very different stylistically. When talking quarterback, I think about Penn State's passing game and Ohio State's secondary, and it's easy to just be like, oh, the Buckeyes have struggled there at times, specifically against Oregon. The Buckeyes are outside our top 40 in both success rate and EPA per pass allowed, and Andy Kotelnicki is very much the driving force for Penn State's passing success metrically because the receivers still leave a lot to be desired. There isn't a Tez Johnson or an Evan Stewart to stretch the Buckeye secondary, so it's on Andy.
What receivers, I would ask, is the better question that Penn State has.
To scheme up looks here, right? And this is a big game for Caleb Downs, right? This is why you paid him substantial money to transfer from Bama to Ohio State. He's allowed 4.5 yards per target. He's got to be tasked with negating Tyler Warren, who you mentioned. Can he do it? Because I don't think Jim Knowles can give that assignment to his linebackers who have struggled in coverage. That's the one unit that has really not allowed Ohio State to be that elite defense because Knowles has to scheme around the linebacker group. It's a group that struggled with eye discipline, and that's really the reason he's left his corners playing on islands because he's needed his safeties to help that linebacker group. Denzel Burke specifically been playing on an island. So I kind of just get back to, yes, it looked horrific for Denzel Burke against Oregon, but there just isn't a receiver on Penn State that I think is really preventing Burke or Jim Knowles from sleeping good this week. But Kansas didn't have an elite receiver group either, and Andy Kotelnicki just designed space. That's what his offense is about. It's why he's so respected. I know Penn State fans are clamoring for Pribula to play. Stylistically, I think he probably fits Andy's system a little bit better. But, this isn't like someone new, right? It's a 2022 three-star quarterback. Wisconsin probably didn't prepare much for him or at all. So you don't want to get caught thinking what you saw last is what happens next. 11 for 13 with an 85 QBR isn't a realistic projection this week for, I think, even the largest Penn State homer. But I think Andy will do a good job in the throw game, making it at least easy for Pribula. If he plays one read window throws type stuff, he'll move the launch point and have Pribula throwing on the run, lots of receiver rubs. But I think what seems clear is, if I'm assessing Penn State's run game, the film doesn't lie, especially if Alar is only 70 or 80%. Pribula opens up Penn State's wide zone run game because just going back and watching that Wisconsin game, linebackers have to respect his legs. So if you watch the all-22 from that game, you see repeatedly the backside linebacker does not fire until it's clear who has the ball. The middle linebackers fire extremely slow and get caught guessing. And if you go all the way back to the preseason, much of that Wisconsin coaching staff thought the linebacker group was the best unit on the entire team, and they struggled. And it really opened things up for Katron Allen and even Singleton at times. Now, on paper, Ohio State's defense has been stout against the run. Top 10 in EPA per rush allowed. They've stayed buttoned up and haven't allowed explosive gains overall. But if you nitpick the last 2 games against Oregon and Nebraska, there's been some moments where the Buckeyes haven't played to the Excel sheet. Jordan James and the Ducks kept kind of pounding them 5 yards at a time. On 23 carries, James averaged 2 yards per rush before first contact. Even with 2 weeks to prepare, Ohio State allowed Nebraska's run game last week to at least locate some explosiveness on the ground. 5 runs of 10-plus yards. So, it's just difficult because my guess is they try to give Alar a shot. And it might not go overly well. So I don't know. That all said, call me square. I don't want Penn State in this spot. It's basically 3.25 in the market Wednesday morning. If Penn State's the 3rd best team in the country, I'm Hulk Hogan. I just,
Hulk Hogan in his peak or Hulk Hogan now off of PEDs?
We should have probably had stronger conviction on Penn State, Todd, as I kind of map this out impromptuvely on my head here. Our reads have been good. As much as we love Kotelnicki, the offense looked clunky, so we stayed away from laying it against Illinois and UCLA. We liked USC in that matchup, and USC, which is downtrended quite substantially after the LSU game, was up 2 touchdowns at half and then imploded.
It's the Lincoln Riley way in the fourth quarter these days.
Yeah, and the right numbers on USC still cashed. Last week we weren't buying the Wisconsin love for beating up tomato cans of Purdue and Northwestern and a really, really poorly injured Rutgers team. But just laying it on the road isn't our style. But the read was right last week as well. So we've kind of been a little bit locked in here on Penn State. At the same time, and this was, you kind of hinted at the top, our 45-minute conversation before we turned on the mics, like, what confidence does Ohio State give you? They kind of got gutted late at Oregon. They're sluggish off the bye against Nebraska. Offensive line is in shambles, as Brad highlighted. And, I kind of, again, transitioned back to what we had said, what happened, 2 years ago. It's playing out in front of our eyes. Like, everyone sucks. These teams are horrific. Like, the top 3 power-rated teams in Ohio State, Georgia, and Texas all have glaring issues. Oregon is working their way into that top 3 because they seemingly have shown the least amount of holes the last handful of weeks, and there's getting guys back healthy. But, if those are the top 4 teams, what's that say about the 5 to 8 programs below them? And, I was looking at this morning, the 2022 Georgia Bulldogs, clearly a historic team. They had a lot of offensive firepower, a better offensive coordinator. Would be a double-digit favorite over any team in the country this season. Even I checked this because you and I went to the Alabama-Tennessee game, Todd, to celebrate your nuptials that were pending. But the 2022 Tennessee Vols team, they would have been the number 1 team in the country heading into this week at this moment by a quarter of a point for us. I mean, it's just...
Hendon Hooker's that dude.
It's created a lot of intrigue because none of us know what's going to go on. And, for fan bases, you got, 25, 30 teams that still feel like they're in contention for the college football playoff. So it's created intrigue for the fans. The product, my fear, it's are we going to start trending towards, the product that college basketball put out there that none of us really want to watch anymore until March Madness comes around? That's kind of how we're trending here.
You don't even want to think about that kind of world in any capacity. If that's the way we're headed. At least we'll know some of the players. Well, at least in theory on the college football rosters, even if they're changing programs every single year.
That's true.
With glorified free agency. Last thing, guys, on this game before we close the book on the big game breakdowns. We've seen this number trend towards 3.5 minus 0.5. Is there any chance this gets all the way down to 3 and takes similar line movement to what we saw when Ohio State went to Eugene and played Oregon?
the line's certainly trending that way. And even if you're make the case for Penn State, it's you'd want a home night game whiteout. This is at noon. It's not for me. Penn State's not for me this week. It is lethargic as Ohio State's looked last week off the bye, and I haven't been as high on Penn State as everybody else.
For Penn State fans, I'm sure they'd love this game at night under the lights for a full whiteout. For college football fans that don't have a rooting interest in either of these programs, I'm thrilled we get this at 9 a.m. out here on the West Coast, given some of the early slates that we've had so far this season in college football. So to get the crown jewel of the day, at least on paper, out of the way early, I'm going to call that a win.
I don't think it's Brad, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't think it's ever conceivable that this were to get to 2.5. But if it did, maybe a cheap money line, I might be forced at that point to back Ohio State. I don't think we ever get that opportunity.
No, I don't think we get 2.5. I do think we'll probably see 3, and I'm anxious to see if we get a cheaper money line. But I made that mistake against Oregon.
It's Oregon. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to make it again.
Oregon and Penn
I was
State
Mr.
different.
I was Mr. Anti-Ohio State.
You were, Brad. I'll give you credit for that. I just wonder if Oregon and Penn State should be viewed as equals right now as currently constructed.
They're not. So.
Yeah.
So that begs the question there. But should be a hell of a game. And one, quite frankly, that it means a hell of a lot more, at least on some level, to Ohio State because their margin for error and some of that wiggle room. If they were to drop this game and have 2 losses, I'm not saying Indiana will beat them, but the game looks to be a lot more challenging on paper than would have been in Ohio State's resume with 2, let alone 3 losses. Doesn't hold nearly the same weight and cachet, even being a big brand, as they would head to the college playoff committee as far as discussion, seeding, and all of that good stuff. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well. I'm, of course, Todd Fuhrman. Follow me, but most importantly, for all things Bet the Board podcast related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And best bet portion of the program, this board has been a muddled mess as we await a lot of the key numbers that are out there. Almost feels like we're better served to wait and try and identify some of these numbers as they come into range for all of us.
I don't think we've ever punted and waited on a college football podcast since we've introduced it, done it a couple times in the NFL. What I will tell you is there's 2 games we are looking at that I think we all discussed before the show that are right on key numbers that we're kind of just waiting to see develop here. And had they been a tick in either direction, they would have been best bets on the show. But what we're going to do is we're going to give this out on our Twitter feed at some point from now before kickoff. So follow at Bet the Board Pod on Twitter. We'll send that out just because you crazy kids have crashed the website when we put it on there. So we will.
We love the enthusiasm. We don't love the website crashing.
Yes. So we will rely on Elon to keep X alive and well for us to deliver a college football best bet. Again, could come 4 hours from now, could come 4 hours before kickoff on Saturday, right? You don't need to inundate us with emails and DMs. It'll eventually show up there. So follow at Bet the Board Pod.
That works. Anything else you gentlemen would like to share with our lovely listenership before we bid them a fond farewell and reconvene a week from today, hopefully with a little bit more clarity at the top of the college football pecking order?
Got nothing.
All right. I will take
Go
silence.
Gamecocks.
I will take silence is golden. And to echo Brad's sentiments, best of luck to all of you, our Bet the Board listeners, with all of your investments this weekend. And most importantly, with a South Carolina Gamecocks ticket in hand come Saturday afternoon, evening, or whenever you check the final score. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.